My mother-in-law told everyone at our wedding that I'd never be good enough for her son. She smiled while she said it, too. And that was the moment I decided she'd regret ever underestimating me. Before we dive into it, tell me in the comments where you're from. I love seeing the different places people tune in from. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss more stories like this. So, here's how it all started. My name's Lena. I grew up in a quiet little town in Indiana, where people still wave from their porches and gossip at the diner. I wasn't born into money, but I was raised to work hard and treat people right. That's what I thought mattered, until I met Caleb. He was charming, patient, and kind in that quiet way that makes you feel seen. He came from a family that summered in Nantucket and used tasteful as a personality trait. I didn't fit in, and I knew it. But Caleb loved me, and that felt like enough. From the moment I met his mother, Vivian, I sensed the chill. Her smile was polite but never reached her eyes. She asked where I went to school, then nodded in that way people do when they're pretending not to judge. The first time she came to our apartment, she looked around and said, "Cozy. Reminds me of my college dorm." I laughed it off, but the sting lingered. The wedding should have been perfect. I'd planned every detail myself, nothing extravagant, just simple and beautiful. During the reception, Vivian clinked her glass and stood to give a toast. I should have known better than to expect kindness. She talked about how her son had always aimed high, and how she was glad he'd found someone who could grow into the kind of woman he deserves. The room went quiet, a few awkward laughs breaking the tension. Caleb's hand squeezed mine under the table, but he didn't say a word. I smiled for the cameras, thanked guests, and danced like nothing happened. But every time I caught Vivian's smirk across the room, I felt something in me harden. That night, after everyone left, I sat in my wedding dress on the edge of the bed and whispered to myself, "One day, she'll choke on her own words." And I meant it. After the wedding, I tried to be everything a good daughter-in-law should be. I smiled, agreed, and bit my tongue more times than I could count. I cooked dinners the way Vivian liked, offered to help her with errands, and always thanked her, even when she spoke to me like I was a guest in my own life. I wanted peace. I thought if I just stayed kind, she'd come around. But Vivian had other plans. She found small ways to remind me that I'd never belong. If I baked something, she'd taste it and say, "It's nice, dear." My recipe uses real butter, though. When I mentioned my job, she'd sigh and ask if I'd ever considered something more stable. At family gatherings, she'd greet everyone by name, then look at me and pause, pretending to search for mine. The room would laugh. I'd force a smile and swallow the ache. Caleb never saw it the way I did. When I told him, he shrugged. "That's just how Mom is," he said, like it excused everything. I started realizing he never disagreed with her, not once. If she wanted him to visit, he'd go, even if we had plans. If she criticized me, he'd change the subject instead of standing up for me. It wasn't just her words that hurt, it was his silence. Over time, things got worse. Vivian began planting little seeds of doubt in Caleb's mind. She'd ask questions like, "Are you sure Lena's happy with you?" Or, "Does she ever miss her old life?" At first, I didn't know what she was saying, but I could feel the shift. Caleb grew distant, quieter, like he was second-guessing things that used to be simple. One night, I caught her slipping her hand onto his arm at dinner, telling him how proud she was of him for choosing wisely. It made my skin crawl. When I tried to bring it up later, he said I was being sensitive. That word, sensitive, cut deeper than anything. That's when I stopped trying to win her over. I began writing things down. Every comment, every little dig, every time Caleb brushed me off. For my sanity, I told myself. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I wasn't just keeping notes. I was keeping proof. Something inside me had shifted, and I could feel it. I wasn't the same woman who'd smiled through her insults anymore. At first, I thought it was a misunderstanding. Bills arrive late. A charge shows up that I don't remember making. Small transfers to accounts I've never seen. When I asked Caleb, he said it must be a bank error. When it happened again, I started looking through paperwork. I found deposits from accounts in Vivian's name and invoices that didn't match anything we'd bought. The math didn't add up. I tried to bring it up calmly. I handed him a stack of statements and asked for an explanation. He flipped through them and kept his voice steady, telling me not to worry, that his mother had offered to help take care of things while he handled a work project. He sounded certain. I could tell he wanted to believe her. I wanted him to look at the facts, but he didn't. Vivian showed up with a concerned face and a folded list. She said she was only trying to protect us, that she'd noticed some spending that might ruin our future. She pointed at a charge and said, with a quiet, automatic smile, that maybe I didn't understand budgeting the way Caleb needed. Her words were small but sharp. She made it seem like she was saving him from me. After that dinner, we didn't sleep in the same room. We argued for the first time in months, and the argument didn't end with a conversation. It ended with the guest room door shutting and the house feeling split down the middle. Silence grew in the spaces where there used to be plans and jokes. I woke up alone on more nights than not. I could feel the house changing. Photos of us on the mantel moved, conversations omitted me, and names mentioned in the past always ended with Vivian's advice. It wasn't only the money. It was that someone else was rewriting who I was in their story. Little choices I used to make, which bank to use, what to save for, who to call, were now handled without me. It felt like being edged out of my own life. Anger replaced confusion. I kept copies of bank pages, printed emails, and the voicemail where Vivian told Caleb not to trust my judgment. I knew confrontation wouldn't help if I had no proof. Quietly, I put together a folder with every oddity I found. Each paper was a building block. Each note I tucked away made the case clearer to myself. When I closed that folder, I stopped waiting for him to defend me. I stopped hoping his instinct would be to stand beside me. Instead, I decided to act. If they thought taking over our life would be easy, they were about to learn I could fight for what was mine. The first time I heard the rumor, it came from Caleb's cousin, who looked at me with pity instead of greeting me. We were at a family dinner at Vivian's house, the kind where everyone speaks in polite tones that hide sharp edges. I could feel eyes on me, whispers under the sound of clinking silverware. Then someone said it outright, asked Caleb if he was doing okay after everything that happened. The table fell silent. I froze. Caleb didn't ask what they meant. He didn't correct them. He just stared at his plate, pretending to chew. My heart dropped. I understood then. It was Vivian. She'd told them I'd been unfaithful. That was her new weapon. I pushed my chair back, barely hearing the noise it made, and walked out of the house before anyone could stop me. The drive home felt endless. When Caleb came back hours later, he didn't ask where I went. He just said, "You shouldn't have left like that," as if embarrassment was my biggest sin. I asked him if he believed what they said. He didn't answer. His silence said enough. Later that night, there was a knock at the door. Vivian, in her long coat and calm smile, said she came to check on Caleb. She barely looked at me. I stayed in the hallway while she walked straight into the living room, like she owned the place. I heard their voices through the half-open door. She told him I'd probably lawyer up soon, that he should protect himself before I took half his money. Her voice was soft, but every word dripped poison. She spoke like someone giving gentle advice, not ruining a marriage. Caleb didn't argue. He let her go on, nodding occasionally, too weak to stop her. I stood there, listening, holding my phone in my hand. I don't even remember pressing record, but I did. Every word she said was captured. Every lie. Every manipulation. When she finally left, I sat at the kitchen table, numb. The next morning, I didn't wait for Caleb to wake up. I packed a small bag, printed copies of the bank papers and the recording, and drove straight to a lawyer's office. By noon, the papers were filed. When Caleb came home that evening, he looked shocked, like it hadn't occurred to him I'd ever be the one to leave. I didn't explain. I didn't yell. I just said quietly, "You should have stopped her." Then I walked away, leaving him, and her, to deal with the mess they'd created. When I left the house, I didn't look back. I rented a small apartment on the other side of town, nothing fancy, just quiet. The first few days felt heavy, but not unbearable. The silence was different there. It didn't hurt. I unpacked slowly, set my journal on the kitchen counter, and stared at the folder holding all the proof I'd collected. It wasn't about revenge yet. I just wanted clarity, something that belonged only to me. Caleb tried calling a few times, then stopped. From mutual friends, I heard he looked lost, like someone who had woken up in a story he didn't understand. Vivian, on the other hand, seemed thrilled. She told her circle of friends that she had saved her son from a mistake. Apparently, she threw a brunch to celebrate. That image, her sipping champagne while my marriage collapsed, stayed with me. It hardened something inside. One afternoon, while sorting through some documents, I noticed a line on a bank statement I didn't recognize. It was linked to Vivian's foundation, the one she never stopped bragging about. Everyone called it her life's work, a charity that gave scholarships and supported community projects. But the numbers didn't make sense. Donations went out, but the recipients didn't exist. I checked again and again, tracing small details. The more I looked, the clearer it became. Money was missing. I started digging deeper. Using what I knew from years of helping Caleb with his paperwork, I searched through public filings, tax reports, and old records. The more I found, the more certain I became that Vivian's good deeds were just a mask. Funds were being moved between personal accounts and the charity's name. It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. The discovery didn't make me happy. It just made things make sense. The woman who ruined my marriage wasn't only cruel, she was corrupt. Every polished speech, every smiling photo in the local paper, it was built on lies. I thought about sending everything to the police right away, but something stopped me. She'd spent years making me look small and foolish. I wanted her to fall in a way she couldn't escape from. So I took my time. I organized each piece of evidence, labeled dates, and noted connections. It wasn't about Caleb anymore. It wasn't about our failed marriage. It was about the truth. She'd stripped me of my peace, and I was going to take hers piece by piece until she finally saw the cost of what she'd done. I met Mara by chance at a coffee shop near my new apartment. She was sitting at the next table, talking quietly on the phone about a job interview that hadn't gone well. When she hung up, she sighed and muttered something about Vivian Crawford's foundation ruining her life. I froze. That name still made my chest tighten. I introduced myself, and after a few minutes, she recognized me. "You're Lena," she said softly. "I used to work for your mother-in-law." We talked for hours. Mara had been an accountant for the foundation for 3 years before being let go without warning. She told me she'd started asking questions about missing scholarship money, and the next week, she was accused of mismanaging funds and fired. She'd tried to fight it, but couldn't afford a lawyer. As she spoke, I realized her story matched what I had already seen in those confusing documents. Together, we started digging deeper. Mara still had copies of old reports she'd saved on a flash drive, just in case. When she showed them to me, the patterns became obvious. Money was disappearing right after big donations came in, always to the same small accounts that traced back to Vivian's name or one of her shell companies. It wasn't sloppy. It was careful, hidden in small numbers that most people would never notice. We didn't talk about revenge out loud, but both of us knew that's where this was headed. Still, I didn't want to confront Vivian directly. She'd twist my words, make me look like the bitter ex-daughter-in-law trying to cause trouble. So I stayed quiet and kept collecting proof, emails, spreadsheets, anything that showed how she'd been stealing from her own charity. Around that time, Caleb reached out. He said he wanted to talk, that he'd been thinking about us. His voice sounded unsure, like he was walking through fog. I agreed to meet for coffee. I smiled, asked polite questions, and let him believe there was a chance we could fix things. Inside, I felt nothing but focus. If I wanted access to more records or confirmation about the accounts, he was the only link. I told him I might stop by the old house to pick up a few things I'd left. He didn't suspect anything. That night, I called Mara and said, "I think I can get what we're missing." For the first time in months, I felt control returning, slowly, quietly, and entirely on my terms. I drove back to the house one Saturday afternoon, pretending it was about closure. I told Caleb I just wanted to collect a few last things and talk. He sounded relieved, maybe even hopeful. When I parked in the driveway, Vivian was already standing at the door, wearing that perfect smile that never reached her eyes. She greeted me as if I were a guest visiting her kingdom. "So nice to see you again, dear," she said sweetly, her voice full of fake warmth. I nodded and followed her inside. The place looked exactly the same, spotless, quiet, filled with that same cold air that always smelled faintly of her perfume. I could feel her watching me, waiting for me to admit regret. "I'm glad you came," she said, pouring herself tea. "Caleb's been so lost without you." She smiled as if she'd already won. I didn't reply. Instead, I asked if I could go upstairs to gather my old papers from the study. She waved her hand dismissively. "Of course, dear. You remember where everything is." In the office, I opened the cabinet that used to hold Caleb's work files. Most drawers were locked, but one had been left slightly open. Inside were folders stamped with the foundation's logo. I slipped on the gloves I'd brought and flipped through the papers. Within minutes, I found what I'd been hoping for: donation forms with forged signatures and fake company names. The ledgers didn't match the tax reports Mara and I had reviewed. Every page was another layer of proof. Just as I started taking photos, I heard footsteps behind me. Caleb stood in the doorway, his face pale. "What are you doing?" he asked quietly. I didn't hide what I was holding. "I'm not stealing," I said calmly. "I'm saving you." He looked confused, hurt, maybe even afraid of what I meant. Before he could speak again, another voice cut through the air. Vivian stormed in, her tone sharp and shaking. "How dare you go through our things?" she shouted, stepping closer. I could see panic behind her anger. She knew exactly what I'd found. I placed the folder back in the drawer, then pulled a small envelope from my bag and set it on the desk. On the front, I had written in neat black ink, "The truth about your saint of a mother." Neither of them moved as I walked past. The house felt smaller as I left, like it was collapsing in on itself. I didn't need to yell or explain. The proof would do that for me. When I closed the door behind me, I knew I'd never walk through it again. The news broke a week later. It started with a small headline in the local paper. Community Foundation under investigation for financial irregularities. By evening, it was everywhere. Reporters waited outside Vivian's office, asking questions she couldn't answer. Donations stopped overnight, and the sponsors she once bragged about began cutting ties. The woman who had spent years controlling every detail suddenly had no control at all. I watched the coverage quietly from my apartment. I didn't call anyone, didn't text, didn't explain. My phone buzzed constantly, but I ignored it. The story spread fast. People wanted to know how someone so admired could steal from the very cause she claimed to protect. Vivian held a press conference 2 days later, standing stiff behind a podium. She said it was all a misunderstanding, that someone had tampered with records. Her voice shook only once when she mentioned me. She didn't say my name, but everyone knew. She tried to make it sound like I was a bitter ex, desperate for attention. Her words didn't land the way she hoped. Every time she spoke, the lies showed on her face. The more she talked, the worse it got. People began to wonder why she was attacking me instead of explaining the missing money. Her own silence about the facts became louder than anything I could have said. So I said nothing. A few days later, Caleb appeared at my door. He looked different, tired, older somehow. He didn't ask to come in right away, just stood there holding a newspaper folded under his arm. "You were right," he said finally. His voice cracked. I stepped aside and let him in. He sat on the edge of my couch, head in his hands. "I should have listened," he whispered. "She played me. I let her ruin everything." I didn't answer. I poured him some water and placed it on the table. He tried to explain, to apologize for every moment he hadn't stood up for me. I listened, but my heart stayed still. There was no anger left, just distance. When he asked if I could ever forgive him, I met his eyes but didn't speak. The silence between us said enough. He understood then that whatever we'd been was gone. After he left, I closed the door gently, leaned against it, and let the quiet fill the room again. It felt peaceful, not empty. Vivian's world began to crumble piece by piece. The board members she once commanded voted her out without hesitation. Her name was removed from the foundation's website, and the plaques honoring her service were taken down. Friends who once filled her dinner table stopped returning her calls. Her reputation, built over decades, vanished in weeks. The woman who had always looked untouchable was suddenly a shadow of herself, hiding behind drawn curtains and silence. Caleb finally accepted what he had ignored for years. The investigators had shown him the truth, the fake ledgers, the stolen funds, the lies. He filed for divorce on his own, sending me the papers with a short note that only said, "You were the only honest one." I signed them the same day without hesitation. There was no anger left, only closure. It was finally over. Weeks later, an envelope showed up at my apartment. The handwriting was familiar, elegant, practiced, the same loops I'd seen on those charity invitations. Vivian's name wasn't on the outside, but I knew. Inside was a long letter. She wrote about regret, how she'd lost control, how everything she did was out of love for her son. She said she couldn't sleep, that she wanted me to forgive her, to meet and talk. The words sounded desperate, like someone trying to rewrite history before it was too late. I didn't answer. There was nothing she could say to erase what she'd done. Instead, I placed the letter in the same box that held my old evidence and shut the lid. Some things didn't need replies, they just needed to end. When the case finally settled, a large amount of Vivian's assets was seized as restitution. The reports mentioned that the funds would be redirected to rebuild the scholarship program she had destroyed. That gave me an idea. I contacted the foundation's temporary administrator anonymously and arranged to donate part of that money myself. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about doing what she never could. On the donation form, I wrote a single line, for the students who deserved better. Then I sent it without a return address. No one would ever know it came from me, and that was exactly how I wanted it. That night, I sat by the window, watching the lights flicker across the city. For the first time in years, I felt no bitterness, no anger. Just peace, quiet and complete. Months passed, and life slowly began to feel normal again. I moved to a small coastal town where no one knew my story. The air smelled like salt and fresh paint from the studio I had just opened. It was mine, small but filled with color, sunlight, and quiet. After years of feeling trapped, I finally built something that belonged only to me. Clients started trickling in, and every project reminded me that I could create beauty out of nothing, even after all the chaos. I met new people who didn't ask about my past. They saw me for the person I was now, not the woman who had been betrayed and broken. One of my new friends, Jenna, often stopped by with coffee. She was curious but kind. One afternoon, while we were arranging samples on my desk, she asked gently, "Would you ever think about going back to him?" I didn't need to think. I smiled and said, "I already did better than that." She laughed, not realizing how true those words were. Every day felt lighter. I took walks by the water, cooked simple meals, and went home to peace instead of tension. There were no raised voices, no hidden lies, just calm. I didn't check the news about Vivian anymore. Whatever happened to her was no longer my concern. Letting go wasn't easy, but I learned that peace doesn't need revenge to exist. It just needs distance. One quiet morning, I found an envelope in my mailbox. It was addressed to Mrs. Crawford, in neat handwriting. For a moment, I almost didn't open it. Curiosity got the better of me, and I tore it gently. Inside was a plain white card with nothing written on it. No words, no apology, no message, just emptiness. I stared at it for a long moment before I understood. Maybe it was from Vivian. Maybe it wasn't. Either way, it didn't matter. I walked over to the small fireplace, tossed the card inside, and watched the paper curl into ash. As the last bit of smoke disappeared, I felt something shift inside me. A quiet ending, one that didn't need noise or witnesses. I whispered to myself, almost laughing, "Guess I finally was good enough." Then I turned off the lights in the studio, locked the door, and stepped out into the soft evening air. The sun was setting, and for the first time in years, everything felt exactly right.